The Remedial Herstory Project is a nonprofit working to get women's history into the primary and secondary history curriculum. To help us meet our goal, we produce media, lesson plans, and so much more. You can check it out on our website, www.remedialherstory.com. Our project is funded through grants and by patrons, potentially like you.
Thank you to our patrons Jeff, Barbara, Christian, Kent, Jamie, Jenna, Nancy, Megan, Leah, Mark, Nicole, Anne, Sarah, Alicia, Katya, Michelle, Jessica, Laura, and Jackie.
If you would like to join these wonderful people and become a patron, you can head over to patreon.com and become a supporter of the Remedial Herstory Project. You too can help us reform education and allow women to be seen, heard, and complicated.
Hey, Kelsie.
Hey, Brooke.
Want to tell everyone what's happening in today's episode?
Today we are headed to the south.
Yeehaw! I don't know.
That's more west. I don't know. And we are going to be talking about upper-class ladies in South Carolina during and after the Civil War.
Oh, bless your heart.
Oh, no.
This is just going bad.
Going bad.
Hello, and welcome to Remedial Herstory, the other 50%, the podcast that explores what happened to the women in history class. Now, here's your host, Kelsie Brooke Eckert, and her partner in crime, Brooke Neva Sullivan.
In this episode, we are going to be asking the question, what changes did upper-class ladies of South Carolina face as a result of the Civil War? And we are joined by Annabelle Blevins Pifer.
What a great Southern name.
Oh, I love her name.
Nice. Awesome.
Yes. She is a rock star, and I'm so excited to learn more about this topic.
Yeah, me too.
I think that, at least in the North, there is a bias towards the victory of the Union and the abolition of slavery.
Right.
And which are noble and good things that should be talked about.
I love how delicately you're laying this out here. Get to it, Kels.
But, we devastated the Southern economy during the war. And
they were like, Anne, take care of it yourself. Best of luck in your southern winter
endeavors, and there's a period of Reconstruction for sure that was probably helpful to fixing some of that, but so much following that period just sort of goes back to the way things were, but in other ways, and especially for women, it does not. And so I'm really excited to learn more about the impact of the war on these upper class women, because a lot of these women go on to be suffragists later. Mm-hmm. And part of that has to do with the transition that they undergo during the war, where they are empowered to
take
step
on.
up.
Cool.
So I'm excited. Why don't we have Annabelle introduce herself to everybody?
Thank you.
Hello, my name is Annabelle Blevins Pifer. I'm originally from Lake City, Florida, and I grew up only about 30 minutes away from the Lusty battlefield. Growing up, I never realized the impact of living in a small town that did a yearly celebration of the largest Civil War battle held in Florida, especially a celebration of a Confederate victory. However, as I do more research and continue my studies, I know that being exposed to history from such a young age really influenced my future career. As I entered high school, I quickly fell in love with American history. This is really saying a lot, because up until 11th grade, I didn't really enjoy history. Then one day, my AP US history teacher pointed out that often history is just a series of cause and effects. Once I saw that and I could find a pattern, I was done for. I knew history was it. In college, I went to my first Old South history class, taught by one Dr. Catherine Mooney. Literally, as soon as I left the class, I walked outside, called my mom, told her I was going to be a history major, I found the person I want to be like, and from then on out, that was my focus. While I was still an undergrad, I learned about a lady whose name was Mary Blinken-Chestnut, and she actually was from South Carolina. After learning about her, I realized that from here on out, I really wanted to study women and their role in the Civil War. I recently graduated with my master's in American history after writing my thesis on upper-class women in South Carolina from about shortly before the war to shortly after. I want to say thank you to Dr. Ginger Davis, Dr. Michael Beaucamp, and most importantly, Dr. Charles Sanders, who helped me research and do the editing of my thesis. I really love to study the period from about 1860 to 1900 in the part of the country referred to as the South. The states that make up a lot of my studies tend to be Virginia, North Carolina, South Carolina, Georgia, Florida, Kentucky, Tennessee, Alabama, Mississippi, and Louisiana. And I know that sounds like a lot of states, but I specify because, according to who you ask, their definition of what states should be included in the Old South or slave-owning South really do vary. These just happen to be the ones that I'm most familiar with and use the most often. Specifically today, though, we're going to focus on upper-class ladies from South Carolina from about right before the American Civil War, like 1860s-ish, to around the end of Reconstruction, which occurred in 1877. Since the capital of the Confederacy was in Virginia, there tends to be a lot of studies in that area that covers the lives of women of generally all class levels and races. But this got me thinking, what about women from South Carolina, the first state to secede or to leave the Union, who really spearheaded starting the Confederate States of America, which from here on out I may refer to as the CSA or the Confederacy. I really found that upper-class women experienced a lot of change in their financial status, their place in society, and the roles that they assumed in the house and in public. As the Civil War progressed, these women who had nothing but privilege for their entire lives found themselves facing starvation, not having adequate housing, and they really lost a lot of their wealth, which meant they lost their status in society, which they used to define their place in the world. So today, we're going to kind of answer, what changes did the upper-class ladies of South Carolina face due to the American Civil War? So let's just jump into where the story began. After the election of Abraham Lincoln in 1860, South Carolinians knew what they had to do. The time had come to secede and create a government in which the rights of the states would be equal to those of the national government, and the institution of slavery would be protected, absolutely. They left the Union towards the end of December 1860, kicking off a 6-month period of states seceding to join the CSA. Elite South Carolinian ladies were excited about the new country and the ability to live free from the Northerners, who they believed posed a threat to Southern interest. The Southern interests at stake were slavery, which was the seat of economic power for many Southern men, and the disruption of a patriarchal society. A patriarchal society is a society where men hold the primary power and are the ones who find themselves in positions of power politically, morally, and socially. Especially in the Old South, or the South before the war, the men were the ones who could vote, run for office, control property, and decide what was best for the family. Women in South Carolina who came from the wealthiest families, usually families who owned plantations and slaves, earned the title of elite, upper class, or planter class. As war became inevitable, these ladies who had always lived by the ideas of being religious, staying pure, being perfectly domestic, and staying submissive to their husbands or male head of house, braced themselves to assume the responsibilities of their husbands, fathers, and sons who would be going off to war. Their preparation came in handy. As the men went to fight, the women felt compelled to take on the job of managing their households, farms, plantations, and the slaves that worked them. The American Civil War, which began in April 1861 and ended in April 1865, forced the ladies of the antebellum era, or the period before the Civil War began, into positions they had never had to fill before. The upper-class women found themselves forced to negotiate financial hardships, shifting cultural norms, political activities, and a drastically altered definition of what it means to be a Southern woman. Once the Civil War began, so did a dramatic reshaping of the norms that defined elite society in antebellum South Carolina, and in no segment of that society were these changes as sweeping as the transformations that occurred in the lives of elite women. Elite women managed the household, the finances, and chronic scarcities of clothing and food required for themselves, their families, and their slaves, and they had to acquire these skills even as they learned how to make decisions by themselves for the first time. In order to understand the changes they faced, we must first discuss what life was like before the war. Growing up in the antebellum South, the elite ladies received an extensive education in literature, foreign languages, and how to be a lady. However, men excluded them from learning politics and how to manage finances inside and outside of the home. The ladies used their education to help keep the household slaves on task, to ensure that slaves under their supervision had clothing and access to medical care, and that the rest of the residents of the house were well fed, had access to clothing, and that all of their other needs were met. Elite women before the war often oversaw all household activities and ensured that adequate food, shelter, clothing, medical care, and religious guidance was available for their own families and the slaves who lived on the plantation. They also had to discipline the household slaves by any means necessary, including scolding them, reassignment of duties, or punishing the slaves. In spite of these duties, upper-class women in South Carolina lived a life of luxury before the war began. They divided their time between their husbands' plantations, their summer homes, and spas, where the women of their class vacation. By traveling between the plantations and these summer homes, they actually were able to continue to socialize and be an active member in society, because you have to remember, plantations were usually further out of the city, and they were really well spaced out, so while the ladies were at home on the plantations, they didn't get much social interaction. But when they would go to their summer homes, they'd get to hang out with all other ladies from their social class. They often wore the most beautiful and stylish silks and laces, usually imported from Europe, and they enjoyed an education provided by their families which was deemed suitable for their gender and status in society. They had access to newspapers, magazines, and books from all over the world, and because they were surrounded by slaves who saw to cooking, cleaning, everyday sewing, fabric production, and other menial tasks, they had ample time to read, garden, and entertain guests. This is definitely where you see some of the difference between women of the upper class society and the lower class, because they had much more time to have these luxury things. When they were sewing, they usually did really detailed embroidery rather than just simply sewing clothing together to make outfits for their kids. They had time to read a lot of books. They had time to garden for fun, to have just their own, flower garden. As a young Southern lady, the parents' economic and social class determined if she was eligible to be considered a true lady and be worthy of elite status. As she got older, her family provided her an education approved by her father, and her mother would see that her education incorporated how to perform domestic skills properly. When she reached her teenage years, her parents, specifically her mom, would begin the process of preparing her for her debut in a society. This debut often included attending cotillions, parties, and other social events in hopes of finding the young Southern belle a suitable husband. A planter-class daughter's main goal, once she reached her late teen and early adult years, was to attract a husband who was wealthy and came from a good family. During the years leading up to the war, young ladies and men would engage in courtships and marriage as long as the young lady's parents approved of her choice of suitor. Often the courtships were short because these couples were eager to receive land and slaves from their parents and enhance their social standing. As the prospect of war became more likely, uncertainty regarding the future resulted in more engagements and marriages. Couples who had been together for a while finally started discussing marriage more seriously, and young ladies would rush into relationships with soldiers passing through or with men in their hometown before they left for war. Women entered marriages with the knowledge that the identity they held before they got married was no more, and that their new identity was that of wife and eventually would likely be that of mother. They assumed the role of the woman of the house and the responsibility of keeping a watchful eye over the housekeeping in the kitchen. As ladies became more comfortable in their new role as wives and plantation mistresses, they experienced the next challenge of womanhood, becoming a new mom. Once women of this era began having children, the cycle of pregnancy and birth was rarely interrupted during their reproductive years. Though they had help of the slaves in the role of nanny, women often had to sew clothing, oversee school lessons, and provide maternal affection for each of their children. It's not like today where these ladies could just go out and buy their kids the nicest clothing and they would just send them off to school. The moms really had to make sure they took on the role of dressing the children to the same standard that they were supposed to be dressed to, making sure they got the best education, and, what parent doesn't want to show love towards their kids? The continuous cycle of pregnancy, childbirth, nursing, and child-rearing really took its toll on couples, especially the women who were left at home having to take care of the children on a daily basis. However, as the war continued, women still found themselves in this continuous cycle of pregnancy, childbirth, nursing, and rearing, because anytime the men would come home, they were still expected to be obedient wives and to provide their husband with more children.
Hey, Kelsie, I don't think our listeners know about the new upcoming project that we're working on.
Which one?
The video series.
Oh, the video series. That's awesome.
I know. So I thought we could tell them a little bit about what the project is, how it's funded, and what the purpose is.
Well, we are producing a video series, 25 episodes on U.S. history, 25 episodes on world history. And the point of these is to provide teachers who don't know women's history with like a 10-minute video that they could play for their class. So say you're teaching a lesson on the American Revolution. Here's 10 minutes about women in that time period.
Amazing.
And it could be a foundation that you can springboard from and do something really cool on those women.
And these videos are, yes, you, but they are fully scripted. You can look at the scripts. They're nicely edited with some really great content.
Yep. They're vetted by historians, 2 PhDs at least in history. So, you know, people smarter than me.
But they're going to be free and they're on YouTube.
And they'll be on YouTube. They also have a comedian from Hollywood who is helping to make them funny. So it's, you know, because I'm like kind of boring.
No, very funny. But that's awesome. So they're really engaging and they're really cool content. So more to come there. So we have those coming out. And those are funded through grants? Through our patrons.
Okay. So their, you know, contributions to us through Patreon are supporting that project. And then we also have a lot of people that have been donating through Instagram, Facebook. We have a Venmo account. You can find us there.
That's awesome.
And they're making those contributions. So yeah, it's an amazing thing. And if this is something that you're like, yes, that's what teachers need, every penny helps because it is a really expensive project. So.
Yeah, totally. And we had a match donor for a while there too, which is really cool. So definitely if you're interested in those, feel free to donate. You can donate right on our website, Instagram, and Venmo.
Yeah.
Which is awesome. Great work. I'm excited to see the rest of those videos.
Oh, Brooke, thanks for your support of the project.
Awesome.
The elite ladies of South Carolina, though, found the most critical aspect of their lives outside of their relationships with their husbands and children was religion and adhering to the beliefs and conducts that defined a godly woman. The most important book that a lady could read and study was the Bible. During the antebellum period, the realm of women encompassed religion, and mothers provided religious instruction to their children, and they led their husbands towards being godly men. To that end, women and children frequently attended church and spent time together in study and prayer in the evenings. As the men went off to war, women often provided their husbands and sons with instruction on how to read the Bible and what verses may be most helpful as they fight for the Confederacy. This actually eventually created a shift of religion from a woman's realm to a men's realm because as men became more comfortable reading the Bible and becoming more familiar with it, they then felt it was their duty to make sure that their families were held to, you know, the highest religious standards. Once the men went off to war, the elite women had to quickly learn how to not only gracefully assume their roles as mother, daughter, or sister, they also had to help handle the male head of house affairs. The absence of men meant that women now had to move into the sphere of male duties, including handling the financial, legal, and political aspect of daily life. They had to begin to make financial decisions for the land owned and the family members that the plantation still supported. Towards the beginning of the war, there were still male figures who could assist in financial decisions and making, decisions as a proxy or substitute for the male head of house who was away at war. Oftentimes, the youngest men or older men in society or those who were injured would still be around. So the male head of house would talk to their neighbors who they knew would still be there and advise them to help their wives whenever decisions needed to be made. Ladies were also able to write their husbands as the war was in its beginning stages, tasked for help and guidance in the decision making. However, as the war continued, many men increasingly left these decisions in women's hands. They often did not have time to write back or were so ill that they couldn't. As the war years progressed, though, there were fewer and fewer men, leaving women entirely on their own to make the financial decisions. No longer could a male relative or neighbor act as a proxy for the male head of house, leaving the mistress of the house to decide what to buy and sell and how much things were worth. Alongside the assumption of head of house duties, women also had more flexibility regarding courtships and marriage. With fewer men in the community, women married more quickly and looked to marry men who fought in battle even if they were severely injured. It was actually considered a source of pride for a woman to marry a soldier because it showed loyalty to the Confederacy. So women would pick men more often based on if they were serving actively in the military rather than if they were the most attractive or if they had the most money. Women also began to marry outside of their financial class. However, they still had a really hard time with the idea of marrying someone outside of their education class, and that would cause differences. So more often than not, women would only really marry outside of their financial class as long as the husband would still be nearly as educated as they were. One of the final aspects of how a woman's life changed in regards to their new role as head of house was to decide if they should flee their family homes and plantations when the Union Army came into town. In the early years of the war, elite women would often flee to other properties that they owned in other areas around the South, or go to family members who were throughout the South or even the North and live with family or friends who lived in safer areas. However, as the war progressed, such options diminished, and they sometimes had to find shelter for their families in less inviting locations, such as abandoned barns, stables, or houses. Women who chose to stay often faced the prospect of having goods from their plantation stolen, watching their slaves flee with their valuable items, and they were harassed by the invading troops. One of the most interesting changes to me, though, was that elite South Carolinian women faced the fact that their role in society was changing. When the war began, women immediately began creating aid societies to help make gunpowder bags, socks, shoes, and hats for soldiers. They also staged plays to help raise funds to support the troops. This was a massive departure from before the war because the South did not have a multitude of ladies' associations due to the geography and the hierarchical structure of the Southern home. Oftentimes, women lived in very small communities that were separated by a bunch of space, and because they didn't have automobiles like we think of today, they couldn't visit each other as easily. Also, as part of a patriarchal society, the men would be the one who would lead any kind of association or grouping that could have any kind of political leaning to it. So, by joining these ladies' associations, they really made a big stride forward in becoming more political beings. The aid societies found several ways to raise funds and donations for the war effort, such as putting on plays and concerts, collecting club dues, or creating fundraisers. One of kind of the interesting facts that caught my eye on this was when the ladies' aid societies first began, they would just put that the women from these different aid societies were involved in the plays and concerts, but women, as a very big step forward, would insist that their names be put in the paper, which was unheard of before. Volunteering with aid societies allowed women to ease into the transition from a male-dominated sphere into one where ladies had to begin to perform the task of both men and women. In these aid societies, women positively contributed to the war effort, easing the burden on their men while also taking the first steps out of the house and directly into the public spotlight. Some elite women chose to violate the norms created by the patriarchal society to a greater degree by accepting public employment or engaging in activities that had previously been deemed unsuitable. And when I say, they've been deemed unsuitable, it was often unsuitable for their gender and also their wealth status in society. Women who are of a lower class were allowed to work in a public sphere in smaller areas. They could take sewing jobs and things of that sort, but elite women never worked, and they absolutely never accepted pay before the war forced them to. In the antebellum South, women in elite society had been barred from writing, but during the war, women such as Louisa S. McCord began careers as authors. Other ladies, such as Phoebe Yates Pember and Ada Bacot, accepted public employment at a hospital. Some of the women who worked within the hospitals, though, they really and truly insisted on not receiving pay. That way, they would not call into question their elite status. Alongside writing and hospital work, upper-class white women found themselves having paid work as treasury girls because of their really neat handwriting, seamstresses because of their years of learning how to sew and embroider, laundresses, nurses, teachers, and boarding house/tavern keepers. For the first time, due to the agricultural bust that occurred during the Civil War. One of the most interesting parts of this history is that during this period, elite women were actively aware that their role in society was changing because men were no longer present. They were also aware that coping with these changes would require them to step out of the domestic sphere that they had always shaped their obligations, opportunities, and choices around. Older women tended to fight some of the changes by refusing to discuss politics in public or accept charity even if it meant starving. Younger women, however, were much more likely to be more politically active. They felt more empowered to speak out against the North. They would often wear pins on their clothing supporting the Confederacy, spitting in the Union soldiers' faces, or actively speaking about the war. Alongside the domestic and societal changes, women experienced economic changes. Until the middle of the Civil War, elite ladies wore the finest clothes anytime they left their house, and they possessed many silk dresses as everyday wear. Along with extravagant clothing, they wore headbands, braids, and flowers in their hair, alongside headdresses made of tulle, lace, and feathers. But with inflation and the Union blockade severely restraining the import of clothing, women had to rewear clothing, buy clothing made of materials that they often would have turned their nose at, or, as a sign of solidarity with the Southern cause, they would wear homespun, which is a coarser, unbleached fabric that they often made their slaves wear. Towards the end of the war, luxury food items, clothing, and books were difficult to find and even more difficult to afford. Women like Mary Chestnut insisted on throwing large, extravagant parties until her husband became increasingly impatient with her frivolity. In December 1863, he declared that there would be no more feasting in this house, this is no time for junketing and merrymaking. At the time she quit hosting these gatherings, however, she still frequented parties and events at her numerous wealthy friends' houses. Through it all, most elite women would attempt to abide by the strict norms of their class, including refusing charity or other sorts of private or public aid. As the prevalence of hunger became almost universal in the South, however, they were compelled to change their status and standards. Mary Chestnut, for example, would accept food from her friends, but she drew the line once offered money. When she ran out of money to buy food, she was forced to confront a reality she could not have imagined before the war. "When people are without a cent," she wrote, "how do they live? I'm about to enter the noble band of homeless refugees, and Confederate pay does not even buy one's shoestrings." Once the war came to a close, elite society women did not dwell on the reasons for the Confederate defeat, though. They actually recognized that almost every aspect of the pre-war South had been devastated, and because of this, they fully appreciated the enormous effort that would be required to rebuild the nation. They were determined to play an important part in that rebuilding and wasted no time in getting started. They founded memorial societies to honor the dead and preserve the memories of those who died in the war. In the years following the Confederate Confederate surrender at Appomattox, women joined together to honor the dead with new cemeteries, monuments, and annual Decoration Day observances. The Ladies' Aid Societies that were active during the war turned into Ladies' Memorial Associations, oftentimes referred to as LMAs. Ladies' Memorial Associations brought together former Confederates across the South to help provide funds and support towards disinterring and reinterring soldiers who fought for the Confederacy when the Union would not properly bury the Confederate dead. There were chapters in every state of the South, and their tireless efforts soon transformed the ladies' groups into powerful civic organizations that shaped the programs of local and state governments. From 1865 to 1890, Ladies' Memorial Associations created memorials throughout the South to honor the soldiers who served the Confederacy in the war. At the end of the 19th century, these groups coalesced into a national organization known as the National Association of the Daughters of the Confederacy. They quickly realized that was a handful to say, and it wasn't as easy to roll off the tongue, so they changed the name to the United Daughters of the Confederacy shortly after the entity became fully established. The original mission statement of the organization asserted that it had been formed to tell of the glorious fight against the greatest odds a nation ever faced, that their hallowed memory should never die. The challenges that elite Southern women faced during the Civil War transformed them from women who were taught to avoid the public sphere into ladies who could create organizations to support the memory of the Confederate South and ensure that their memory lived on long after they were gone. Elite ladies also began working outside of the house, writing literature and journals, and engaging in public discourse regarding issues that concerned them. In short, the American Civil War shaped them into a new type of Southern woman who no longer depended exclusively on men to carry her throughout her life.
Annabelle, thank you so much for sharing this story with us and for your time and your energy that you put into pulling all of this together.
Thank you so much for having me. I can't wait to teach everyone about how women played a part in the Civil War.
I know it's such a crucial piece that I feel like is missing. When I think about the Civil War, this piece, I think about the war, and this is about the impact. And it's so and also the very real lives of women who lived in this war. So, to dedicate yourself to writing a thesis on this, you must have felt some sort of like personal motivation to do it. Why do you feel like this history is so important?
So personally for myself, I actually find military history to be kind of boring personally, I will admit. I love, studying the Civil War and growing up in a Civil War town. It's so cool to go to the reenactments, but all you see is these ladies walking around hoop skirts. You can't put a name to them. You can't put a face to anyone. When you're at battle reenactments or studying about it or going to a museum, you're not going, oh, this lady here, that. And I personally had an issue with that. I enjoy cultural history a lot, but the war wasn't just fought on the battlefield. How did the men get the clothing? How did the men get the food? How were they able to sustain themselves while they were traveling all across the country or the southern to some of the northern parts that we think of, but ton of miles covered, and they were able to stay fed and clothed. So who did that? Who ran the houses? Who kept the children going to school and things of that sort? So for me, it's really important to put faces and names to these people because women really had to step up and play a really important role in how does the home front work without the men? Because people tend to forget that the Civil War, nearly every single household lost some kind of soldier, whether it's father, brother, son, and especially in the South, by the end, the only men who were at home were people who were usually invalids, couldn't walk anymore, couldn't see, were too elderly or way too young. So someone had to step up and do the role of making sure financial stuff was taken care of, making sure everyone had food to eat. So that's kind of how I got into it. And it was one of those ones, I jumped in studying one specific person. And when you look at just one specific person, it tends to narrow everything in too much. So it's important to kind of pull back a little and see what was around and who was around. And as I kept studying, these women's lives unfolded in front of me and really watching their growth from more so meek women who, stayed at home, listened to their husbands and did these things, to women who had to go out and fundraise, who had to talk about the war publicly, to women who had to run everything themselves and draw on their inner strength. It surprised them, and I think it surprises the reader today because you don't think about that.
It's sort of a transition too, because so many of those Southern women become suffragists in the years that follow, and how powerful, what a powerful connection to understand why, right? They're like, I have stepped up. Let me do my thing.
Well, there was this powerful transformation that, once women kind of got this taste of being in the public light on some way, shape, or form, they really realized that they didn't want to continue to stay in the house and only watch things that were going on in the house. This is how they kind of made that shift into memorial associations. And they were the ones who really stepped forward and made sure that, Confederate soldiers got buried in Confederate graveyards. They were the ones that did the dedication days. They were the ones that made the monuments happen. And what has the biggest impact on us today is they were the ones who actually helped recreate educational materials.
Yeah.
Who really memorialized the men as they saw them. And I guess the easiest way for me to sum it up, especially when I'm telling my friends about this research, all the men had guns to lay down. The women didn't. So the war didn't end for them the same way. They didn't have something to sit down and walk away from. They were still at home.
That's really powerful. They didn't have guns to lay down. I love that idea. So I think, in social studies ed, we really want students analyzing primary and secondary sources of information. Is there a place that you could direct teachers and students to find more on this that they can work with in the classroom?
So personally, I'll admit I started by looking into Mary Boykin Chestnut. And once I started looking her up, other names come up. Google Scholar tends to be my best friend. You can find all kinds of resources there that'll lead you to different academic institutions, give you access to free PDFs and things of that sort. So that's how I stumbled across women like Ada Bacot, Phoebe or Pember Yates. And it kind of led me down this rabbit hole because once you find one or two journals that these ladies have written, you start finding a plethora. Also, I'm a big fan of whenever you decide to research anything, it does not matter what it is, find like the most popular book. So in this case, it was actually a book by Drew Gilpin Faust called Mothers of Invention. And it talks about how women kind of transition from these very timid, mild-mannered, always listen to their husband ladies to women who actually felt comfortable in the public sphere. And I flipped to the notes section in the bibliography and I started finding the sources she used. And from there, I was able to move forward and find other sources. Really and truly one of the most powerful tools is going to someone else's bibliography.
Yeah, that's really powerful. So that's Mothers of Invention. I love that.
That's a really good read. I read it originally like in a Kindle edition, and then I had to get a physical copy so I could sit there and bookmark everything there too.
Yeah. Oh, that's awesome. Well, Annabelle, thank you so much for your time and energy. I think this is such an important topic to get into the classroom, and I can't wait for more to transform public education to be more inclusive. This is very cool.
I very much so look forward to it. I'm glad that you guys are doing this project because I know as a woman in school, I really didn't love history until I got kind of towards the end of my grade school years because I didn't have anyone who I could see or who I could connect with. And having that key piece left out of the picture was really hard. I remember as a little kid dressing up as presidents' wives because that was just neat and it was a face and a name. But once you got to middle school, high school, even those faces and names got pushed to the side. And it's just hard. That's part of the reason I enjoy being a women's historian.
Yeah. Oh, you're on the cutting edge, transforming the field.
Oh, one can only hope.
Well, thank you so much. I appreciate it.
Thanks so much for listening to Remedial Herstory, the other 50%. Please subscribe, rate, and review wherever you listen to your podcasts to bring more voices to the conversation. We really appreciate that effort. Until next time.